Lockdown Wash. Welcome to the latest episode of the Pandemic Podcast, where we're going to take a deep dive into the latest developments within the UK COVID-19 inquiry, which has had some of its latest hearings this week, including today, where we had Dominic Cummings taking the stand. Now, this public inquiry into the UK's response to the COVID-19 pandemic got underway earlier this year. So far, it's heard from a variety of expert witnesses, including politicians such as David Cameron and George Osborne, who oversaw pandemic preparedness and laid the conditions for the National Health Service going into the COVID chapter. It's heard from some of the scientists who advised the government and from former Health Secretary Matt Hancock. Now, you would have thought some of these investigations, some of these hearings would have brought up some pretty damning evidence, but actually some of the most damning evidence has not come from the witnesses themselves, but rather the mountain of material that's been made available in the form of WhatsApp conversations nonetheless. Yes, that truly scientific tool that is commonly used within business for communications. Now, the WhatsApp messages that have been handed over themselves have revealed an awful lot, but there's also a great deal of controversy around how much of the WhatsApp-based evidence has been deleted or suppressed. It's been made clear that one of Boris Johnson's key aides turned messages into disappear setting within a key COVID WhatsApp group only weeks after the ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson promised a public inquiry. How convenient. Now, it's also been revealed that Nicola Sturgeon, along with over 100 senior members of the Scottish government, have deleted their WhatsApp messages relating to Scotland's pandemic response and therefore won't be able to submit their evidence to the Scottish or the UK public inquiries. Now, this to me sounds like evidence tampering. In any other case, it's deleting key witness statements. So it's very clear that there are plenty of government ministers who don't want the inquiry to see what went on within those messages. In fact, the UK government fought a long legal battle to even attempt to prevent the release of WhatsApp and Signal messages to the inquiry. But the High Court, fortunately in July, ruled that it must hand over 2 years' worth of messages from ministers and nearly 40 other senior figures and advisors. Nonetheless, many of them are still missing, and many other ministers are still trying to hide the evidence. So this, to me, is perverting the course of justice, to use legal speech. However, what we can see in the messages that have been made available is the childlike petty squabbling, the incompetence, the power games, and the outright chaos that became the daily reality within the government's response. We can also see how quickly the tides can turn, with more questions now raised about who was really driving pandemic policy in the UK. Now, the latest hearings have resumed this week with some of the more powerful former advisors in Downing Street called in to give evidence, including former communications director Lee Cain and former chief strategist Dominic Cummings. As I record this, the inquiry is still underway, but I wanted to give an update as things move in real time. Now, to set the scene, the public inquiry is supposed to be about learning lessons to help prepare for a future crisis. But having watched large amounts of today's hearings, it's clear that the inquiry is extremely biased, with leading questions that prompt towards a full lockdown wash, as I describe it. Critics of the lockdowns who have previously been able to submit evidence, the few critics, including Professor Carl Hennigan and Dr. Sunitra Gupta, have largely been discarded. In fact, I watched Professor Carl Hennigan give evidence at the inquiry, and if I had any doubt whatsoever that this inquiry was going to be a completely biased exercise, I have no doubts whatsoever now. He was constantly rudely interrupted with hostile questions and even attempts about Herminium character assassination. But as ever, in true professional form, Professor Hennigan remained calm and polite despite those impositions. Now, it seems that many of us watching the hearings or reading the transcripts, if you have the time, is that the chair, Lady Hallett, and the lead counsel, Hugo Keith, are basing their approach on a particular preconceived view of the story of the pandemic. That is, lockdowns. That is, that COVID was a clearly dangerous threat to UK health, and that lockdowns were the correct and only solution to the problem, and that the only real question is the timeliness of the government's actions and not their merits. Now, this entire inquiry appears to be predicated on these terms, and from the outset, Council have framed their questioning on the basis that it was indisputably a highly dangerous, fatal viral outbreak, and that by February, this viral outbreak, this severe pandemic, as they describe it, this viral pathogenic outbreak is coming and can't be stopped. Now, even hardened lawyers and epidemiologists, it has seemed, were bunkering down because the virus is coming it was a fatal pathogenic disease. This is the entire framing of the inquiry. Now, this means that the very fundamental basis of the key questions that should be asked, the fundamental premises upon which the policies were built, are not even being addressed. They're not even having any significant focus as part of the overall investigation. There's been no serious examination of the modelling and why it turned out repeatedly to be so wrong. Professor Neil Ferguson refers briefly to Sweden in passing in his written evidence, but only to dismiss it. Yet he was not asked about this whatsoever. And it's increasingly clear that there is a predetermined answer to this inquiry, and it's just going through the motions. At least that's how it seems. And again, as I watched today, watching the leading questions, it's very clear there's no critical thinking here. There is no pursuit of truth. There's no pursuit of a different viewpoint, even now in hindsight, where we can quite clearly see the collateral harms that have been caused by policy. There is very little discussion around this at all. And it's actually becoming increasingly evident from today's evidence that there was a clear focus on the herd immunity strategy put forth by the Great Barrington Declaration in the early stages of the UK's preparedness plan. Such a plan which was followed by Sweden and have now got far superior results. And in fact, Dominic Cummings said today that the UK's first national lockdown was viewed as a completely crazy idea. Many of us would agree. Mr. Cummings said that the prevailing view at the start of the pandemic that there was no way nationwide restrictions could ever be introduced in Britain. The government was working on the assumption that lockdown was not possible in a Western country as COVID struck, and he went on to say that sage scientists collectively agreed with the government's original plan to pursue herd immunity in order to overcome the situation by September 2020, based upon this exposure strategy. Now, I even remember going back to the earliest stages of the pandemics, there was some simple explanations of the herd immunity strategy that made perfect sense when you read them. But then something radically changed. Something drastic happened on the 13th of March in 2020, whereby a plan B was sketched out on a whiteboard. This was, in fact, brought into the evidence today, which made explicit that to stop the NHS collapsing, once again, our beloved NHS, there would need to be a lockdown to save lives. Now, it's clear from the evidence that Boris Johnson was incredibly skeptical and inquired how they could, in fact, prove that the herd immunity model was the correct strategy to follow. And he went on to say that this is his quote, we're killing the patient to tackle the tumor, meaning the cure is worse than the disease, and that large amounts of people who will die would die anyway as a result of their underlying conditions and old age, referencing the mortality statistics. Now, this has been taken completely out of context by the media, of course, but Boris was questioning why we're destroying the economy in the country for people who would be very likely to die in the near future anyway. And of course, it's a highly emotive topic, of course, and anyone who lost family members during that time, clearly it's a very difficult conversation to hear that in a policy discussion. But the reality is we have to look at it holistically. We can't look at it individually. And something turned the tide on the 13th of March. And this change of the tide created ripples around the world that became a wave of lockdowns that soon became the de facto policy response to COVID. And we need to know why and how that tide changed, because that's something that the WhatsApp messages certainly do not tell us. What we see from the WhatsApp messages is incompetence. We see the infighting and the bickering and the name calling, but we don't see what actually changed the policy. But you can see a whole variety of different viewpoints and how things should be done. And, there's all this scapegoating of Boris Johnson, but quite frankly, it looked like he was bombarded by different information and different conflicting ideas. But we have to ask what then led to that landslide towards Plan B, and why did that become the de facto principle, not only in the UK, but worldwide? The precautionary principle became inverted in the collective mindset, and it's also inverted in the collective mindset of this inquiry itself. And what it meant from that conception of Plan B, the introduction of lockdowns and a whole range of impositions on our freedoms, unscientific impositions, or at least if they are scientific, this is what the inquiry should be looking at. But what happened then from Plan B, the introduction of Plan B, meant that almost anything that the government then did was against a backdrop of justification to protecting the NHS, saving lives, And this entire reversal of the precautionary principle meant that the government could get away with almost anything. Now, in my view, all of this time and effort that we've spent so far and money on the COVID inquiry would be better spent on focusing on one important question, which is whether the lockdowns were indeed the right policy response to a disease with a fatality rate of somewhere between 0.1 to 0.5%. Underpinning all of this is a cultural safetyism. There's the idea that almost everything is now catastrophic, everything is hyperbolic, everything is sensationalized, and this has become almost a cultural standard. And we have to ask how this has happened. Where is the resilience? Where is the ability to think critically? Where is the ability to lead in the face of crisis and take bold strides? And this, to me, is a more damning question to ask, because it looks beyond the scientific evidence to look at the cultural scene that we find ourselves in. And so far, the inquiry itself hasn't looked at this whatsoever, but it's important questions that we must ask, because it has ramifications beyond the COVID response. It has ramifications in the way we're seeing academia unfold. It has the ramifications in the way that we're approaching things towards the climate, and how this sensationalistic, catastrophic approach is now determining this, going from zero COVID to zero carbon and everything else in between. So it's important that we look at these other cultural, social dimensions. We also have to look at what's driving this. What are the driving forces, not only of the type of approaches that we're seeing in the face of any challenge within this so-called perma-crisis world that we live in, where everything is a crisis. This is something that we really need to get our heads around alongside the science. Now, critics at Us for Them, who have long fought for the rights of children, have put forward what they believe the inquiry is going to conclude, and I couldn't agree more. And they've said after 3 to 7 years, and quite frankly, based on the speed that it's going at right now, Dominic Cummings was stopped several times today to say, slow down, we're struggling to capture evidence. You may think the same about me at the speed I'm going at right now. But this inquiry is going to last a long time. It's going to take a lot of bureaucratic process. It's going to take a lot of attention and a lot of money, estimate up to £200 million, if not more. But here's what Us for Them has said is the likely conclusion, and let me know what you think in the comments. Now, to quote, the government and its official scientific advisors mostly did their best in the face of what they rightly and fairly believed to be the most devastating viral threat the world's ever seen. You can just hear it now, can't you? Those scientists gave the best advice they could under the circumstances, were entitled to assume that the government was taking account of other factors. If it hadn't been for Brexit, of course, that's a unique problem we face in the UK, but of course, we're not going to avoid using it as an excuse. We would have been better prepared. The government perhaps could have thought a bit more about the impact of the lockdowns on the economy, but ultimately lockdowns were unavoidable. And again, be careful. These are not my words. These are this is what Us for Them have put forward as what the inquiry is likely to conclude. And I don't agree with the sentiment, but I do agree with what's likely to follow. If it at all, it should have been done faster and harder. That's been the sentiment so far within the inquiry. The UK may have come out at a better place clinically and economically. The sacrifices imposed on children, the isolating those who missed all diagnoses and treatments were regrettable, but had to be done. Again, that precautionary principle. If we could have saved one more person who died of COVID, we should have done. The NHS did a superb job in difficult circumstances. I mean, this just sounds like a narrative that's been pre-written. And the final thing, of course, the icing on the cake, that the COVID vaccines came along to save us, and that we should devote even more public funds to partnerships with those heroic pharmaceutical giants and those irreproachable scientists at the WHO. This conclusion is almost foregone. I can completely concur with the team at Us for Them and foreseeing what the likely conclusions will be made. And the reality is the inquiry is now hopelessly compromised by these partisan and presumptive words of its own chair and the leading lawyers who are conducting the inquiry, setting us up for this doom loop of catastrophic errors that we cannot afford to repeat. Because it's clear that if this is the foregone conclusion of the public inquiry, then, and the embarrassment that it is, and not only the embarrassment of the inquiry itself, but actually the embarrassment to the legal profession in the way it's been conducted. It's jeopardizing the reputation of the English legal system, or is it? Because, of course, the legal system are thoroughly on board with this entire process. But its exorbitant costs already cannot be justified. There's only worse to come, it seems. Now, If this is the case, it's really true that we must find other ways to avoid such occurrences happening in the future. If this is going to take 3 to 7 years of our time, then we need to start thinking about how we can use our time wisely. Now, open letters have already been written criticizing the manner and approach by which the inquiry has been conducted so far. It's my belief that we do need to put more focus into doing so, more of this activity, and forcing the inquiry to ask the right questions and include a more diverse group of panelists. And that's not diverse in the true wokest form of selecting people based upon their personal characteristics, but rather the diversity of expertise and views, no matter what color of the skin that they're in or gender or whatnot. It's about diversity of perspective that we need here, unlike Lee Cain's view this morning, or push for the entire thing to be abandoned, giving these seemingly foregone conclusions. Now, what is abundantly also clear is that we need to look at other ways to make sure that this kind of shambles never happens again in the face of a potential health threat or any other event. And it's clear that the tide that we're swimming in right now is beginning to turn. In fact, as I record this, it's the second day of Jordan Peterson's ARC Forum that's taking place in London this week. In fact, I'll be attending tomorrow in London. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon and evening. So watch this space in my reporting on the proceedings at Jordan's ARC Forum. I've got my own healthy skepticism about that already, because it starts to feel like an inverted WEF already. But I have to be careful what I say, because I'm only looking at it from an outside perspective, and at least there is some sensible conversations happening, but we have to look at the mechanics and how they're comprised. And what we don't really need is just the inversion of what already exists. We need something completely different, in my view, a new model, but it's in its infancy. I'm excited to see what's been put together. There's some great people involved. They're asking the right questions. They're challenging the right ideals. But it's the way that it's constructed. But I'll speak more about that when I have a deeper knowledge. I confess I'm only scratching the surface at this moment in time. But we need more of this approach. We need more organizations coming together to challenge narratives. We need more formalization of the evidence, because the evidence is all out there. And if the inquiries that we are seeing aren't asking the right questions, then we must be asking the right questions ourselves and bringing together the most foremost experts, but not to create echo chambers, but to really to challenge the evidence together to make sure that we don't go through anything like this again. But it's very difficult to do so when there is this overall attitude base within the world right now of fear. We're in a culture of fear right now, and until we escape that, then the rational mind will always be subjugated to the emotional, ideological, and that, to me, is the greatest challenge that we face. And a great one that I take on personally, it's an important one now. I ask myself every day, how can I live more boldly, with more courage? How can I become even more resilient? Because after all, society, culture itself is merely a reflection of who we are. And if we want it to change, if we want things to change, then we have to change. So as always, I look, how can we bring this back to ourselves, which excites me, because right now, as we're planning for the future of this podcast, we're going to be relaunching a new show soon, rebranding and simplifying the show, and bringing you a relaunch of our community, where we're going to be asking these bigger questions ourselves and looking at how we can embody the change we wish to see. So if you'd like to find out more, please join the Pandemic Podcast newsletter. Please do this at danastingregory.com/pandemic. It's the Pandemic Podcast newsletter. You hear about all our updates. And of course, you'll help us to mitigate against all of this censorship. We spent the last 12 months not being able to reach anyone on Facebook, and we've had limited reach on YouTube. We're on all the alternative platforms, but you know what? Most eyeballs are still in these mainstream platforms. So please do join the newsletter. Watch out for our latest updates, and look out for my broadcast from London, either tomorrow or Thursday, after I've participated in the final stages of the ARC Forum at Jordan Peterson's event. Thanks for tuning in. Please share this episode. My name is Astin-Gregory, and this is the Pandemic Podcast.